Hello.
Oh,
Hello?
oh, hey,
Hello. Yeah.
got me there.
Calling Chris Anderson. I don't recognize this. Where are
You
you?
know what? Obviously, I'm in Toronto. Can you tell?
Oh, that's beautiful, Toronto.
Yeah.
Fantastic. What a lovely city. It's so happy to see you there.
I'm calling Rick Byer in
The same old place.
All right.
My
All right,
sweet
well,
home, Chicago.
There you go.
And yeah, it's all good here. And welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help and assistance of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. And Chris and I, well, we travel the globe, but still we just feel that urge to be here every Sunday afternoon to talk to you about history. Here we are. And today we're going to be talking about Britain's King Edward VIII, later known as the Duke of Windsor, and some of his unsavory connections, history, etc.
Yes.
Chris, who's with us today? Is there anybody out there? It just looks like there's a fair number of people.
Quite a few, yeah. Ted Moon has joined us, Doug McCord, Judy Rowan from Florida, Paul Sawyer, Lorelei Combe from California, Steve Davis from Vermilion, Ohio, the Templins.
I see Wally is there drinking some Calvados, and
Yeah.
Susan Yu from Maryland, and Lorelei from California. Hello. And Tom and Emily, just a great-looking crowd of folks here.
Yeah.
So that's fantastic that they're all here. And what are you doing in Toronto, Chris? What's going on there?
I'm making another donation to the IKEA Corporation, buying lots of really crappy furniture so that my daughter can move into her apartment for university. So that's
Well, fantastic. Best of luck with that.
Thank
Sounds
you.
like
Thank
amazing
you.
fun. And
oh yes, me and my hex wrench.
and I'm glad that you're there. So, Chris, do you think we killed enough time and we can actually
I
get
think
this
so.
show started?
Absolutely.
Well, why don't you give us a cue and we'll do that.
The bar is open.
The bar is open. You know, Chris, I want to say that one of the most jaw-dropping, unbelievable events of the 1930s, at least for folks living in England and maybe for some of the rest of the world as well, was the shocking abdication of King Edward in just something that really shook people. And I have a great clip from Ed Morrow and Fred Friendly's Hear It Now records, which I listened to as a kid, which helped fuel my lifelong love of history, and it kind of brings you this moment in a way that's unforgettable.
But the biggest news story was in London and concerned political intrigue, an empire, a Baltimore beauty, and the King of England. On the night of December 11th, as Big Ben tolled the hour, London cinemas were deserted, New York subways empty at their usual rush hour. In Eugene, Oregon, and Johannesburg, you could hear the world quiet down.
This is Windsor Castle, His Royal Highness Prince Edward. At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. Believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love.
Now, many tellings of this tale end with this moment, the abdication of the king. But Andrew Lownie, our guest today, in his new book, Traitor King, he starts with that moment, with Edward stepping down, and then goes on to delve into all sorts of sordid happenings that happen after that. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Andrew is the author of Stalin's Englishmen and the Mountbattens. He's been educated at Cambridge and Edinburgh. He helped set up the Spy Museum in Washington. And behind the scenes, he's been involved in bringing several other guests to HHH, including David O'Keefe and Sean McMeekin, who both appeared several times. And Andrew,
For which we are
now
eternally grateful.
We are very grateful for both of those guys. We are also delighted to welcome you out from behind the curtain in here to join us to talk about your book. Thank you so much for coming.
It was a pleasure to be with you.
Excellent. Did you happen to bring a cocktail? We didn't check beforehand, so I don't know if you have one, but I thought I'd ask.
I'm afraid I started a bit earlier. It's 9 o'clock here in Britain, so had a few hours behind me. So I've moved on. I'm now on to Lemson.
Fair enough. Andrew, let's start with the very simple question. Why did you begin where you did, and why another book on the Windsors? Is there something new to say?
Well, I think there is something new to say. And I started in 1936 because that's when most of the books end. Even the really big books, Official Lives, only devote about 50 pages to the last 50 years of Wallace's life. But it was a period that I think is probably the most important. And I call the book Traitor King because I'd long had the feeling that the king was not the innocent dupe of the Nazis, but was an active intriguer. Excuse me. And this has been backed up by a lot of the primary research I've done in archives, not just in Britain, but in the Bahamas and Portugal, in Germany, Spain, and elsewhere. And I think what's interesting is this material, a lot of it, for example, captured German documents, have been available for the last 60 years, and people just haven't bothered looking at it. Excuse me, or haven't drawn the right conclusions.
You okay there?
Very, very evident from the material that's in the archives that there's a very different story to be told. And this, of course, casts fresh light on the abdication. It suggests that the reason the royal family were so against him was not so much the abdication, but because of his treachery. And I think also there's a very strong sense from my research that people didn't want him to come to the throne. He was seen as, excuse me, too politically active, too pro-German. And they'd hoped that he would kill him. He would be killed in a steeplechase accident before he came to the throne. That didn't happen, but Wallace came along, and they maneuvered Wallace. They used her as a pretext to get him off the throne. So this wasn't also a great love story. What I show is that this was a woman who was forced, in a sense, to marry him. He threatened to commit suicide if she didn't. And she felt chained to him, but just had really no choice.
So Andrew, I mean, I know for most of our audience are Americans, and at least over in America, this story isn't quite have the longevity or the presence that it does, say, in Britain. Just for the benefit of people who might not be totally aware, very briefly, what's going on? So what has happened, and why is this a crisis?
Well, what happens in 1936 is the king is determined to marry a divorcee, Wallace Simpson, who comes from Baltimore. Now, she's already got 2 living husbands. He's head of the Church of England. The church, as head of the church, he cannot marry a divorcee and be king. And so he's forced to make a choice. Now, in fact, there were lots of other choices. He could have had a morganatic marriage, i.e. she wasn't queen but his wife. He could have kept her as a mistress. He could have married her after the abdication, after the coronation, rather. But there is this crisis, which in some ways is encouraged by the Church of England and by the politicians, because, as I say, they want this as an excuse to get rid of him. And instead of fighting this, he sort of gives in. In some ways, he's just not up for the fight. And everyone has seen this as a great love story, that he's given up the throne for the love of this woman. But I'm afraid it's not quite as it seems.
Andrew, I just, first of all, do you need to get a drink of water? I'm concerned for you, so we want to make sure that you survive for the entire show.
Yeah, I should be fine now, thanks.
Okay, so if you do need to at any time, we're very understanding of that. Chris and I can always talk amongst ourselves for a moment. Or
Rick will break into song.
Right.
There's always a danger that all of those things will happen. The Duke of Windsor is embraced by the Nazis, I think, and returns the love, and that some stuff happens very quickly after his abdication. But actually, that story really starts before he's even king, that he is being targeted by the Nazis, or at least targeted makes it sound like he's a dupe, as you say, but there's a sort of a collaboration or an interest going on that involves the man who becomes Hitler's foreign minister, von Ribbentrop. It involves Wallace, it involves all sorts of stuff, but it happens before Edward's even king. So take us back to that, so that will help us understand what happens with him and the Nazis immediately after the abdication.
Well, I mean, Edward VIII, or the Prince of Wales, is at this point before 1936, is very pro-German. He is 16th, 18th German. His mother is a German princess. He speaks fluent German. He has a lot of German cousins, many of whom have become Nazi generals, Prince Philip of Hesse, the Duke of Saxonburg, and others. So there's been a lot of contact with the Germans. He's very much in favor of the Führerprinzip. He admires what Hitler has done in Germany after 1933. And he's already showing signs of interfering in politics. He tries to interfere with the Anglo-German naval agreement in 1935. And then even when he's king in March 1936, he downplays the remilitarization of the Rhineland. So it's very evident that his sympathies are with the Germans. He's very keen to avoid another war. He's very keen that the Germans, in a sense, and the British should work together, the Anglo-Saxon nations, and that their real threat is the Soviet Union. And the Germans realize this. And as you say, they target him. They send a German agent called Stephanie von Hollenhauer to London. They actually send Ribbentrop as a German ambassador there because he's friendly already with Wallace Simpson. There's some suggestion they've had an affair. And so there's this pincer attack on Wallace and the Prince of Wales and the King, even before the moment of the abdication in December 1936. And this is what's worrying people that in government, that he's very indiscreet with his red boxes and the secrets. He is leaving them open, entertaining German diplomats.
The red box is an expression that some of our American viewers might know. The dispatch boxes, right? Because he reviews all these government documents.
Yes, sorry, I should explain this. These are the documents, the secret documents that are given to the monarch by the politicians to read each night and to look at and sign off. And all these documents, which of course should be kept in great secrecy, are being left around his where he's entertaining all these German diplomats. So they're seeing this stuff. So eventually he's no longer entrusted with secrets. And in fact, we reached the extraordinary point where King George V orders his son to be put under surveillance by the equivalent of the FBI, the MI5, and Wallace as well. And one of the things that emerges from this surveillance is that the so-called love affair, they're both having affairs with other people, him with an Austrian princess and her with a used car salesman. So
it sounds like he got the better of that deal. I don't know.
So I mean, it's just what I found extraordinary is, I mean, my instinct was that there was another story to be told, and the more research I did, the more it became clearer that there was another side to the story, and we've been basically fed a very curated version of events, and that's largely because most of the documents have been destroyed. I had to go to other countries to find the documents, or to look in people's private papers, because the public version has basically been censored.
Well, I want to get into that, and I'm going to get into my next question by reading something from Sir Alan Lascelles, who was private secretary to the Duke. He says that, then King, he says that the King was like a child in the fairy story who was given every gift except a soul. There was nothing in him which understood the intellectual or the spiritual sides of life, and that all art, poetry, music, etc. were dead to him. Is this a fair assessment of this person? And if so, how did his contemporaries view him? I mean, is this...
I think that's a very fair assessment. I mean, Tommy Lascelles, who of course appears extensively in The Crown, I think was a very shrewd commentator. And so anyone who knew the Prince of Wales or the King or the Duke found him to be a person with no sense of public duty, not very bright, lazy, very self-entitled, and someone who, as he says, has no sense of soul or any sense of loyalty. I mean, one of the things that emerges in this book is not just his treachery, but also his financial shenanigans. He's constantly, he starts off by trying to rip off his brother at the abdication by pretending to be poorer than he really is. And throughout his life, he's caught in financial scandals, black currency dealings, trading with the enemy, all sorts of things that again have been covered up, but show him to be in a pretty venal sort of character.
Can I just follow up real quick?
Yes, you can.
Thank you, since I just cut you off.
No, you didn't cut me off.
But coming on from that, if he is this type of person, and clearly people recognize this, how is he allowed to even get to the point where he can get involved in these things? I mean, I'm just amazed sometimes that somebody just didn't say, you just need to just go away.
Primogenitor, Chris.
Yeah.
We see this problem even with the current royal family. We see it with the problems with Prince Andrew, in which there are certain parallels. They are given advice, but they don't necessarily take that advice or have to take that advice. And I think that was the problem. I mean, Tommy Lascelles and others, were warning him, but he didn't listen. He thought he knew best. And throughout the book, there are accounts of ambassadors, even protection officers, courtiers, equerries telling him to do something and him doing completely the opposite. So, for example, he consorts with Nazi agents and he's warned they're Nazi agents, but he continues to deal with them. And this is the problem. When you are a member of the royal family, you can basically do what you want.
So, we get a question. We're going to jump around here a bit, and so it should help you stay on your toes a little bit. But we have a question from one of the folks in our audience who says, talking about Winston Churchill, and Winston Churchill very famously is an ally of King Edward VIII before he abdicates. He's fighting to sort of help him stay on the throne. He's defending him. And yet, obviously, he doesn't seem a person worthy of Winston Churchill's defense. So what's going on there? And does Churchill change his mind as time comes to show Edward's affiliations with the Nazis?
Absolutely. Churchill was a great monarchist, and he believed in the institution, which is why he was head of the King's party during the abdication. He is, I think, appalled when he discovers the chicanery that goes on over the finances. So that's the beginning of, in a sense, his disillusionment with the Duke of Windsor. He then discovers, because the Duke is under surveillance from all sorts of quarters, about his treachery. And actually, he threatens him with court-martial. He is the man who sends him off to the Bahamas as governor to keep him out of the way. And then after the war, he tries to cover up the story, not because he's sympathetic to the Duke, but because he just believes in protecting the monarchy and protecting George VI. But for example, after the war, he's invited on a cruise by Onassis. And when he discovers that the Duke and Wallace Simpson will be on the cruise as well, he actually then refuses the invitation. He really wants nothing to do with this traitor. And so the whole situation changes.
So, Andrew, getting on, I'm kind of continuing on with a little bit about these personalities. Could you just spell out what you think basically their political views were and what their views were towards race, since this is all kind of obviously towards Jews, and this is at that time when this is an issue?
Well, the Duke is very anti-Semitic, and there are lots and lots of stories, and a lot of his friends tended to be very rich right-wing American businessmen who were also anti-Semitic. One of his great friends was Clint Murchison of the Kennedy story. And he remained to the end of his life a great friend of Oswald Mosley. Now, one of the concerns at the abdication was that Edward had support from the British Union of fascists. And if he became king, that would be a sort of rallying point for the fascists. There were big demonstrations by the fascists around the abdication. And they surged down to Buckingham Palace on December the 11th. The next day, there was a big rally in central London. So that was always a great concern amongst the authorities, that he would be some sort of focus. And in fact, in the States, they set up a sort of pro-Duke of Windsor party, which again was monitored very carefully because it might just bring people together. Of course, he was very sympathetic to the isolationists during the war. And again, one of the problems there was to keep him out of the States and away from isolationists, because he kept giving interviews to papers saying that America shouldn't come into the war. So he was, to the end of his life, believed that Hitler was a great man. So he was pretty unreconstituted Nazi. Even when everyone else, even when we'd seen the concentration camps and everything, he really didn't change his views.
So almost immediately after he gets married, he and Wallace get married in France. Almost immediately afterwards, they end up, we all want a honeymoon in Berlin and have a chance to meet Hitler and the Nazi gang. But that's essentially, I mean, I'm exaggerating a bit, but that's essentially what they do. They head off very quickly to Berlin and suddenly are photographed, many great photographs with all these Nazis, and with just accidentally happening to wave your right hand around as you're with a bunch of Nazis. So what happens? Why does he end up in Berlin? And what are the Germans thinking? And what is Edward thinking at this point? That why this is a good, if he's able to think at all, why this is a good idea?
Well, the trip to Germany in October 1937 has a sort of personal aspect and a political one. The personal one is it's one up for his brother. He just likes annoying Bertie. And it's overshadowing him, who's just come to the throne. He also wants to give Wallace, in a sense, the equivalent of a royal tour. And the Germans play up to this. They invite him on this, in effect, state visit to Germany. And the man who organizes it is a man called Charles Beddoe. Charles Beddoe is a Franco-American businessman, but he's also, in effect, a German agent. He has huge interests in Germany, and this is his way of currying favor with the Nazis. So basically, it's a deal. Beddoe has lent his castle to the Duke to have his wedding in June 1937, and in return, the Duke goes to Germany to basically make Beddoe's life easier with the Nazis. And of course, it serves his own interests. It's a slap in the face for his brother, and it's a way of basically, showing his support for Hitler. Hitler sends him a wedding present, and in fact, he actually broadcasts to Hitler just on the eve of the Second World War. So, he's very, very sympathetic.
Well, and he and Wallace meet with Hitler, right?
Yes, and on this trip, they meet all the Nazi leaders in October 1937, including having tea with Hitler. And they remain in touch. There's no doubt that he is drawn to Hitler. He visits SS training camps. He even goes to a concentration camp. It's disguised as a meat factory, he's told. But
well, that's
it's quite appropriate.
Yeah, sorry.
So I don't think there's any illusions about what he's doing, and that's why the British authorities are so appalled. But it's a little bit of two fingers to his brother, and a little bit of a thank you to Charles Beddoe.
But he's got to know. Okay, it's 1937. Hitler's been in power for 5 years. There's not a lot of mystery where things might be headed. It seems like an awfully drastic move to do as I'm going to give two fingers to my brother, or the finger to my brother, and please my friend who's my host, unless he's also really actively thinking, yeah, this might be good because this might get me back on the throne with these guys as my backers. Do we know what he talked about with Adolf Hitler?
No, it's very interesting that there must have been a record kept, but the record is never surfaced. And after the war, when many of the German documents were discovered, which everyone thought had been destroyed, the minutes of the meeting with Hitler were not found, and that's always rather surprised people. So whether they were destroyed at some point or no minutes were taken is under some discussion. But it's very clear that he was sympathetic to Germany. He was very happy to be publicly identified with Germany. As you say, at this point where we knew about the concentration camps and the anti-Semitism and the fact that we were eventually going to have to go to war with him. And of course, he continues this. It's not just before the war. Even in January 1940, he comes back to Britain and tries to intrigue against the British government and to encourage a sort of pro-German party there. So there's a very, very detailed record that you can follow of his pro-German activities.
So it's pretty easy to figure out pretty quickly that the pair of them are both pretty odious individuals. And we can go on about lots of examples of how odious they are, but I think one of the things that really sets your book apart from all of the other books that have been written about this is the detail that you go into about some of why he's a traitor, right? It's not simply he's just dim-witted or he has bad friends, but he's actively looking to betray his country. Can you, without giving too much away, just like maybe pick up one or two of these threads and talk about some of the things that he's actively doing to...
Well, I think the very obvious moment is something called Operation Willie, which is in the summer of 1940. He's been evacuated to Portugal. He's waiting to catch a plane to come back to Britain. And he makes all sorts of excuses to stay in Portugal. And we know, again, from these captured German documents and from Secret Service reports in the Portuguese archives, that he's talking to the Germans about the possibility of coming back as a go-lighter figure. And the Germans have offered him large sums of money, said that you can sit it out in Switzerland, and then as soon as we occupy Britain, you can come back as the new king. And he's very open to this, and we know this from the captured German documents. The other, I think, pretty incriminating evidence is the material from Tommy Lascelles' diary, from an MI5 officer called Guy Liddell's diary, who are actually monitoring all this, and also the fact that he's communicating in code with the Germans, even when he's left Portugal, saying, "I'm very happy to come back." Excuse me.
Well, as you're, Andrew, get yourself a glass of water.
No, that's okay. No, sorry, fine.
But there's a quote when at this time when he's in Portugal and the Germans are making all sorts of overtures to him. The German ambassador sends a cable to Berlin and says, he, meaning the Duke, is convinced that had he remained on the throne, war could have been avoided, and describes himself as a firm supporter of a peaceful compromise with Germany. This is actually after the war has started. The Duke believes with certainty that continued heavy bombing will make England ready for peace. That's a pretty, that sounds pretty treasonous. I mean, that doesn't leave a lot of room for doubt at that point, does it?
No. I mean, the great thing I think about the book is it's all documented. It's all from documents at the time, either ambassadors talking back to Berlin, or private diaries of British officials reporting on what's happening, or these Secret Service surveillance reports. So, I mean, it's these aren't assertions or speculation. This is based on actual diary entries and letters and all sorts of other things. But absolutely, he was communicating in code with the enemy, which was a capital offence. And there's just so much evidence of his dealings with the Germans. And it's very interesting that when the negotiations with the Germans break off and he leaves for the Bahamas at the beginning of August 1940, that is the day that Hitler begins to bomb Britain. So he's held off until these negotiations have really failed. And one of the arguments is, okay, he never then came to Britain as king, but that's only because the Germans didn't invade Britain. If the opportunity had arisen, I'm sure he would have come.
There's a passage in your book that I found just very poignant and moving. And you say that, talking about the start of the war, the next day, war was declared. The Duke's reaction on learning the news from a call from the British Embassy in Paris was to remark to his wife, "Great Britain has just declared war on Germany. I'm afraid in the end this may open the way for world communism." He then returned to the swimming pool and dived in. So, this international cataclysm has just happened and he's swanning in the pool. Just again, mostly for our American guests, can you kind of sketch out what was his World War II role? I mean, what did he do?
Well, he was in France in exile. He'd been kept away from Britain after the abdication. And when war broke out, Churchill sent a plane for him on the 3rd of September to bring him back to Britain. He was worried that he might be kidnapped. And he said, "Look, I've got too much luggage. I can't fit it all on the plane. You'll have to send a destroyer." So that's what they did. They sent a destroyer for him and his luggage. And he came back, and he was determined. They were determined to do something with him, and he was keen to do something. So they gave him a job as a liaison officer to the French First Army, which required him to go and look at the defences particularly the famous Maginot Line. And he wrote a report on this. He reported how bad the generals were, the poor morale, and the fact that the Maginot Line was very strong, but it stopped. And if you wanted, you could nip round the side through Holland and Belgium. And this was, of course, reported back to the British, who didn't really make much of it. But he also passed this information to his friend Charles Beddoes. And we know that Charles Beddoes passed all this information about the defences to the German ambassador in The Hague, who passed it back to Ribbentrop. So he betrayed the French defences, and as a result, the Germans changed their war plan and were able to overrun France very quickly in May 1940. So it wasn't a very glorious war. And then, of course, when the Germans began to approach Paris, he abandoned his post and fled to the south of France to get away, leaving behind his staff there to face the music on their own. Took the only car and all the petrol.
You know,
Not a person to have on your side, basically.
don't be so easy on him, Andrew. Tell us what you really think there. And so then that's when he goes to Portugal. That's when Operation Willie is involved, where the Germans are collaborating with him. Maybe they're trying to get him to Spain so he can to kind of keep him in reserve there for them. It's scary stuff. And the Maginot Line, when I saw that quote in the book, it kind of like blew my mind, especially when you consider that he lived most of his life after the war in France, and the French were very good to him. I guess they didn't know that part, I assume. We have another question from the audience that I wanted to get to. And it really is, it's the what if question. What if he had become king? I mean, he did become king, but what if either he had stayed as, I guess this really is a question about how he would have fared as king if he'd been allowed to stay in office, as opposed to coming back in as a puppet of the Nazis. If he had simply not abdicated, weathered that crisis somehow, how would history be different? What would his kingship have been like?
Well, it's a very good question, and indeed I have a section at the end of the book where I look at the fiction about the Duke of Windsor, and almost all of it is focused on a sense of counterfactual story of what would happen if he'd been king with the Nazis. I think if he had remained king and Wallace hadn't appeared on the scene, he would have come to some sort of accommodation with the Nazis. I mean, the appeasement policy would have been followed through, and I think the situation would be very different. We probably wouldn't have had a war with Germany. I suspect they would have taken France, and we would have let them do that, and then they would have turned their energies on Russia, and it would be a very different story. And if, of course, he'd come back in the summer of 1940 and they'd invaded Britain, he would have been this go-lighter figure. George VI and Churchill would have been executed or forced to flee, and he would have been back in Buckingham Palace. So there are, a lot of very interesting scenarios that one could explore.
Can I push this a little further, Chris? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, but did he have enough power? You say they probably would have made an accommodation with England, but with Germany. But he's not the prime minister, although he gets to pick the prime minister. I guess one could take it up to 1940. Would he somehow have tried to not pick Winston Churchill as prime minister, even though that was who Chamberlain had recommended, and try to push someone else in his stead?
Yes, I mean, clearly we have the battle in Norway, which leads to the fall of Chamberlain. But I think, the policy would have been very different in that period in 1939, the beginning of 1940. Okay. And I don't think Churchill, after it was a pretty close run thing between Churchill and Lord Halifax. Lord Halifax was an appeaser. So I think we might well have seen Lord Halifax as prime minister if Chamberlain had gone, and not Churchill. Much of the House of Commons was pro-appeasement, and it was only really through force of personality and because of the problems in Norway that Churchill came to power. But I think we would have had done some sort of accommodation with the Germans.
So up a bit, Andrew. We talk a little bit about his trip to Germany, some of the things that he was up to as the Nazis are getting closer to war, and then just at the start of the war. What is the attitude of the average British person to their former king swanning around Berchtesgaden? I mean, does this affect his reputation at all, or is it? I mean, obviously, it's not a secret.
No, I think the people are appalled, and British public opinion is appalled, not just official opinion. He was always much more popular in the States than he was in Britain. It's a bit like Prince Harry. He's seen to be an embarrassment, and the less we have to do with him, the better. And will he just keep quiet and go away? So absolutely, and of course, some of this is covered up by the press. I mean, some of it is covered up. Is reported, but for example, he makes a broadcast on the eve of the Second World War from Verdun, which is broadcast in the States, but the BBC actually suppress it. So there's quite a lot of censorship to play down what he's doing, because of course this isn't the story that the British want, and there's then later pressure put on him to cover up his dealings with the isolationists in the States. But they were always, I mean, even after the war, they were joke figures in Britain, whereas they were revered in parts of America and seen as, and people just believed the myth of this great happy couple who had been badly treated by the royal family.
Well, this is a question that we had come in earlier, but to kind of play off something you just said, what were his dealings with the isolationists in America?
Well, he goes to the Bahamas as governor in August 1940, and he's there until more or less the end of the war. And the real pressure point really is until December 1941. He's giving interviews to pro-isolationist papers without getting permission. He's been very indiscreet. He's saying that America shouldn't come into the war, that Germany should basically be, left alone. And he's constantly trying to go to the States, ostensibly for Wallace to have dental treatment, but to mix with some of these isolationist figures. He's very involved with James Mooney and others who are trading with the enemy. He's very close in the Bahamas with a man called Axel Wenner-Gren, who is another of the Nazi agents. He's been known as Goering's pal, who again are operating as intermediaries. So he's showing himself to be a nuisance and an embarrassment. And constantly he's having to be sort of slapped down and basically tried to keep in the Bahamas where he can't get up to too much mischief.
So one of the questions that came in here from one of our viewers asks if Queen Elizabeth has ever made any comments about Edward VIII, the Duke of Windsor. And I mean, to what degree did the royal family ever reconcile, if they did at all? And I know this has been covered in fiction and stuff, but what's the real story about how the royal family really responded? I guess I would go back to a previous question that somebody else also asked and say, how did his brother feel about all this, and then how has the rest of the family dealt with it, and was there ever a reconciliation?
Well, there was a semi-reconciliation. In May 1972, just before he died, the Queen visited him in Paris. But I think that was really for the public. That was not necessarily a private reconciliation. It just looked better. Everyone knew he was dying, and it looked like it was squaring the circle. I think also they were very keen that he should return letters and garter robes and things. And so it was basically a softening up process of Wallace to make sure that she did that. And she did. She returned about 3 lorry loads worth of material, which was put in the Royal Archives and has never been seen since. So there were a lot of secrets that they wanted to scoop up. I think also the royal family, having frozen him out and wanting nothing to do with him, realized that didn't look very good, and therefore they had to make overtures. And really, by the late 1960s, he was no longer really a threat in any sort, and therefore they could pay visits to him and send him flowers. But he never, for example, was allowed to stay at Buckingham Palace. Wallace only had one public engagement with him in Britain in the whole of that period. So they were still pretty determined to freeze him out. The Queen Mother had felt that Bertie taking on the throne when he did led to his early death. The Queen, I think, was brought up very much under that belief that her father had died because of the strains of office and because he'd been forced to take on this job. I don't think that's entirely true. I mean, he was a heavy smoker and died of lung cancer, but it's having been his favorite niece, he'd been her favorite uncle. I think she was very much conditioned by her parents' view that this man had betrayed the institution, betrayed the country, and was someone that she should just keep an arm's length from.
So there is literally, he dies. It's like the body's barely cold. The trucks are pulling up to take away the papers. And they are then put in the Indiana Jones warehouse, the version of it that's over in the UK someplace, never to be seen again. That's a treasure trove. I mean, given that the Queen just fairly recently released. Gave access to the papers of George III. Perhaps we can expect that in about 250 years there'll be access to the papers of the Duke of Windsor.
So yeah, I think a lot of the stuff's been destroyed already. But that's right. I mean, there's material from Queen Victoria's reign which is still closed, and it's part of the sort of culture of secrecy in this country, particularly relation to the royal family, which makes writing about the royal family very difficult. And means that actually we've got a very partial view of our history.
Well, and I want to kind of dovetail with what you've just said there, Andrew. And the war is getting back to the war. The war's over. There's no secret about what the Nazis did, or what fascism was, or any of that. And there's very little that people don't know about, at least the public perception of what the Windsors had been involved with. How is this story covered up? How does this begin to turn into this great love story as opposed to these are two odious people who there should have been some reckoning with? And how, because you go into some detail about sort of how the cover-up begins or how this...
Well, I suppose the main cover-up is about his treachery, because what happens in May 1945 is all the German documents relating to his dealings with them are actually found buried in a forest in Germany. And instead of being destroyed as they were supposed to be, they were actually saved by a German official who used them basically as his calling card to the West. And when these documents come, there's a huge battle between the American historians who want to use them in the Nuremberg trials and to write the history of the war, and Churchill, who lobbies Eisenhower and other American leaders to basically destroy them. Now, this is a great victory for American historians who say, no, this is history. We don't care about the reputation of the Duke of Windsor. And eventually, because they, in a sense, have possession of the documents, there's not much can be done. And though some, I think, are destroyed, the result is that after a long delay, eventually in 1957, these documents are published and used, and the story is revealed. But what's interesting is that though this stuff's been out since 1957, historians seem to have ignored this material or chosen to ignore it. I think one of the reasons for that is that most people who write about the royal family are very sympathetic to the royal family, and they rely on access to, in a sense, people in the royal circles to write their books, and therefore they're not going to do anything to scare the horses. So it's really a new generation of people like me who couldn't care less about having those sort of contacts, and also preferment. Almost all the royal historians have ended up with some sort of honor, and I couldn't care less about that. So I think it's a new generation is beginning to say, look, let's tell the truth about this. And also you just can't keep hiding this material. The material has emerged. For example, though a lot of the British archives are destroyed, there are mirror copies of some of these files in Bahamas relating to his time there, which people just haven't realized was there. And so the documentation is around, you just need to look for it. Quite how the myth of this great love affair arose is again hard, but I think it's just people are romantic. There were various accounts, their own books painted this picture of this great love affair, and that is the story that everyone's wanted to believe, because it's a much more romantic story than the truth.
It's the fairy tale, right?
Yeah, the fairy tale. But
It's the
unfortunately, the fairy tale ended when they got married, and she realized what she'd let herself in for. And she felt chained to this man who was obsessed with her. I mean, he certainly loved her, but she increasingly resented him, was bored by him. She in fact was bored by him before they married. That's not normal in a marriage. And so she began to have affairs quite quickly, including within a year of marriage with William Bullitt, the American ambassador in Paris. And then later had an affair with Jimmy Donahue, the heir to the Walworth fortune, who was himself bisexual, and it was said that she'd given up a king for a queen.
Okay, all right, just calm down, Andrew. Just calm down.
And that's before I even get to Scotty Bowers and the orgies in Hollywood.
Well, and we haven't even discussed the murder mystery in the Bahamas, which is so. Hey, why not? Just give us a brief. But we don't want to give away everything in the book. But there is also the Duke and his wife go to the Bahamas, and he is the governor of the Bahamas, and I think that's around when this wonderful picture was taken, and they. But he makes friends with a local businessman, and they're real tight until this guy wakes up dead one day. And
Wakes up dead?
Yeah, yeah. That's
a feat.
Yeah, he wakes up dead.
Wake up.
That must be a hell of a hangover. And he's not suspected in the murder, but I don't think. But I mean, it's pretty. It's still kind of a mystery even today, isn't it?
Yes, the Harry Oakes murder from July 1943 is still. No one has ever been charged for it or never been convicted of it. And I think the great mystery there is that the Duke basically steps in. He should be leaving this to the law authorities and the police. He steps in immediately, and one of the first things he does is to move the Commissioner of Police to Trinidad and basically off the patch. And then instead of calling in the FBI or Scotland Yard or even a police presence on the RAF base there, he brings in two crooked FBI agents from Miami who've been working for Mayor Lansky. And they finger Harry Oakes' son-in-law, who is almost convicted and in fact saved because they see that they planted fingerprints and evidence. And anyway, he's got off.
Crazy.
But it's very clear that the Duke has been heavily involved in covering up this murder. And one of the reasons he's covered it up is the man who committed it, who is a man called Harold Christie, whose family is still very active in the Bahamas.
Allegedly, can we go with the allegedly committed the murder?
Allegedly.
Just
He's
for
dead.
Our lawyers prefer the use of the word allegedly.
He's dead, and we don't know. No one has ever been convicted, but certainly Christie, Oakes, and the Duke were working together in a financial syndicate to take money out of the Bahamas and invest it in Mexico. So this is another one of the financial scams he's involved in.
So Andrew, what are the we're kind of love to get advice from people that have written far more books than we have and are a lot smarter. But if you could, I had a question about process. How do you go about researching a topic like this, where obviously where a lot of the material is, they're not going to just provide it to you? I mean, how do you tell this story?
Well, I mean, I do a lot of research. There are over 1,000 footnotes in the book, and I only use probably about 20% of the material I research. I research all over the world. I go to archives that people don't normally go to. I'm about to come to the States and do some research in archives in Washington, New York, and LA, which in Boston I didn't get to during the writing of the book. There's material often in private archives, which people don't realize is there. I use a lot of Freedom of Information requests, and I do a lot of looking in what we call adjacent files. So I do a huge skimming operation, literally look at hundreds of files that you might not think have something, but often you find something is copied in there. And so by going to lots of different countries, as I found a lot of stuff in Portugal, I found stuff in Russia. The stuff is often there, and it's just a matter of an instinct. I do all the research myself of knowing where to look and where you might just find some things. I mean, in this case, the people are dead, so it's very difficult. But when it's possible, as with the Mountbattens and with my new book, which is on the Duke and Duchess of York, they're clearly people who knew them, and I make a point of going and interviewing people. So it's a huge operation. But I think a lot of historians are pretty lazy, and they rely on just regurgitating secondary sources.
Right.
And what I always do is go right back to the original sources when I can.
All right, don't be lazy. Is it Robert Dallek, the LBJ historian, whose advice is always read every document? I can't remember if that's
Yeah,
that's
well,
what it is.
Yeah.
That's
Read
good advice.
Every
Absolutely.
document. Listen, and you have been involved in an effort, engaged in an extended and expensive fight. I think it's fair to call it a fight to get unfettered access to Lord Mountbatten's diaries as part of your effort, either on this book or your previous book or both. And that's an interesting story that's been in the news recently. So our viewers probably don't know anything about it. Give us the gist of what this story is about your efforts here, and kind of what the latest news is on it.
Well, the story goes back to 2015 when I began to research the previous book, a book on the Mountbattens. And I knew that Dickie and Edwina Mountbatten, who they eventually ended up as Viceroy and Viceroy of India, had written to each other pretty much every day. They were often apart, and also kept very extensive diaries. These have been quoted in their official lives. So when I went to the archive where their papers are held and asked for them, I was surprised to be told that they knew nothing about them. And eventually, after various freedom of information requests and bringing in the Information Commissioner, who is the sort of tribunal for information requests, the sort of ombudsman, they ruled that this material should be released. In fact, this material had been bought with public monies for £5 million to be opened to scholars. And so it was a scandal that it should be closed. In fact, it was closed on the say-so of only one individual, the archivist, who then asked to edit the material himself in an abuse of his position. So I then have had to respond to an appeal against that decision. That decision came in 2019. So after my book came out. But I felt there was a very important principle here, and also it was a very important collection that should be open to scholars. So I've continued to fight this appeal. We've just had the ruling in November. I succeeded in getting 99% of the material released, some 35,000 pages. About 100 redactions remain relating to the royal family. But it's been at huge personal cost to myself. It's cost me close to $500,000, basically all my savings. And that has in a sense been the personal price I paid for this case. But I just felt there were very, very important principles at stake about access to archives, about censorship, about academic freedom. And I'm now trying through the courts to see if I can recover those costs, and have actually set up a crowdfunding operation to try, if I don't get those costs, to try and get some of those costs back. But it sort of shows you how determined I am to get material released, because these documents, of course, are the building blocks for historians. And it's, again, all part of this wider story of the royal family, in a sense, censoring our history.
Yeah. Well, you can absolutely see the building block. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to ask if you how people can find that crowdfunding site to be able to support your efforts, because that's an amazing effort that you've put into this, and very worthwhile.
Well, it's very kind. It's called Crowd Justice is the site, and then if they just type in my name, they will find the page. And some of the coverage that we've had, the story has gone right around the world, particularly of interest to India. But I think it is a very important principle. So any support, much appreciated, because I've still got quite a big bill to pay.
Well, and I would just say to the folks in the audience, I'm sure somebody can find this link and post it up in our comments area. And so we're going to depend on you to do that. And we'll give the floor over to Chris for a last question here, because we are getting on to the end of our hour.
Well, I was just going to say, you absolutely see the building blocks of your work in this book about the Windsors and your other books. One of the things that I was really curious about, you have something of a reputation back home in the UK and here with writing biography. And I'm curious, is there something about biography as a form that you find as a useful way of writing history, or is it something? Why are you drawn to biography as a way of telling these stories?
Yeah, I think biography is all about. I think history is all about people, and I think both for making it accessible to people, but also it's actually what history is about. History is changed by individual actions, by a Putin or whatever. It's not driven by huge determinist elements, or not most of the time. And so biography is a really useful way of I say, personalizing history, of trying to understand it. I'm a great believer in family history, house histories. That sort of micro history that really helps you understand something. And of course, for a biographer, it's a bit like writing a film script. You take the camera in and out. You try and give some context, of course, so people understand what's happening. But it's all about the episode, like a film script. You've got to show rather than tell. And I'm fascinated by the psychology of people and why people act in the way they do. And both the Mountbattens and Traitor King were portraits of unusual royal marriages. The Mountbattens, this very loving relationship, marriage, very much a public partnership, but where they both had extensive affairs elsewhere. And Traitor King, this rather bizarre marriage where he was obsessed with her, but she couldn't stand him. But the worse she was to him, the more he liked it. And now my next book is on the Duke and Duchess of York, which is again a rather unusual marriage because they got divorced and yet they seem to have a much happier relationship than any married couple I know. So I think that always rather intrigues me, and I think we're all interested in other people's marriages and what makes them tick. So that, in a sense, makes it seem much more contemporary. And royal history is very interesting because, as I say, most people who write about it are sycophantic snobs rather than historians. And we have the crown, so people, in a sense, have some understanding of some of those events.
Well, don't be expecting your invitation to Buckingham Palace anytime soon. At least not based on this show. Andrew Lownie, thank you so much for joining us today. And Andrew is the author of the book Traitor King, and obviously a very dedicated historian, great researcher. It's a well-written book, and it's worth taking a look at. Traitor King.
Absolutely.
Andrew, thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
All right. Cheers and stay well.
I'll get back to my lemon sip. Yeah.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
I gotta say, I like to think I'm a dedicated historian, but I'm not ready to put my life savings into that. So
hats off, yes.
I know Andrew's still listening. Hats off to that. Yeah, absolutely. I have a lot of respect for that.
Oh, by the way, we'll have to post something, but Andrew also did a documentary about the Traitor King, which was on BBC, so available in the UK, but you said you couldn't get it in Chicago.
Yeah, it's not here in the US yet, so we hope it will be soon. And I think his book is either just coming out or just about to come out in the US after already having been out in the UK. It may have the publication date maybe July, but I think it may be for sale already in some places.
So make sure you get a copy.
Take a look for that, please. And Chris, we are going to be on an encore episode next week. We are going to be sneaking away to do whatever it is we do when we're not here on Sunday afternoons. So can you tell us a little bit about our what we're doing, what we're coming back to next week?
Revisit Judy Battalion's book, The Light of Days, which is an incredible story of probably the gutsiest women you're ever going to read about in history, the Jewish female fighters that did what they could to roll back the horrors of the Holocaust. It's a very moving story.
And that's our Mother's Day show. So
yeah.
You see the connection
don't mess
there.
with Mom. Don't mess with Mom.
Don't mess with Mom. Well, that's another exciting episode of History Happy Hour. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Be safe.